Guests sit over there. This table's for family, my mom commanded, indicating a wobbly chair beside the trash can. Everyone chuckled while I ate alone. Then the cake came out, and so did the bill. $2,600. The waiter handed it to me. I just stood up and proclaimed, "You might want to try the family table instead." I, 29M, should have seen it coming when Mom insisted on hosting my birthday dinner at the fanciest steakhouse in town. The same woman who'd made me eat bologna sandwiches while my half-siblings got takeout pizza was suddenly concerned about celebrating me properly. The hostess led us through the dimly lit restaurant, past tables of well-dressed diners, to a large circular table in the back. Mom had reserved it for 12 people. Herself, my stepdad, my 3 half-siblings with their partners, and supposedly me. The mahogany table gleamed under the soft lighting, expensive wine glasses already positioned at each setting. That's when Mom delivered her line with theatrical flair, gesturing toward a rickety chair positioned awkwardly beside the service station. She announced that guests should sit over there, while this table was reserved for family. The implication hit like a slap. After 29 years, I was still just a guest in her life. My half-siblings erupted in laughter. The youngest one actually snorted wine through his nose. Even their partners joined in, probably thinking they were witnessing some charming family tradition. The waiter standing nearby shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the cruelty for what it was. I took my designated seat without protest. The wobbly chair creaked every time I moved, and I had a perfect view of the kitchen doors swinging open every few seconds. The smell of grease and dishwater drifted over from the service area. Meanwhile, at the family table 10 feet away, everyone was having an animated conversation about vacation plans and career updates, topics that apparently didn't require my input. The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 months earlier, Mom had called asking for help with her mortgage payment. Some medical bills had piled up, she'd explained, and she was behind by $2,000. I'd transferred the money the next day without hesitation, even though it meant delaying my own car repairs. Family helps family, I told myself. Now, as I sat alone picking at the cheapest salad on the menu while they ordered surf and turf, I couldn't help but calculate how many mortgage payments their meal would cost. The waiter approached my isolation station and asked what I'd like to drink. I requested water. At the family table, they were passing around a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Mom caught my eye once and smiled, the kind of smile you give a distant acquaintance you're being polite to. Dinner conversation flowed around me like I was invisible. My half-brother talked about his promotion at the law firm. My half-sister shared news about her engagement. The middle sibling complained about having to buy a bigger house because their current one was too small for their growing art collection. I ate my salad methodically, each bite more bitter than the last. Not from the dressing, but from the realization that this was my family's true opinion of me. The person they called when they needed money was the same person they couldn't spare a seat at their table for. When the main courses arrived, the disparity became even more obvious. They'd ordered the works: prime rib, lobster tails, truffle pasta. The waiter placed a small chicken breast in front of me, apologizing that it had taken longer because they'd had to prepare it separately. Even the kitchen staff knew I didn't belong. That's when I started planning. I excused myself to use the bathroom, but instead pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. The family table was about to learn an expensive lesson about treating people like outsiders. I made a few quick calculations, checking my available credit and transfer limits. When I returned to my wobbly chair, dessert was being discussed. Mom announced she'd already ordered a custom birthday cake, my birthday cake, though she made it sound like she was doing me a tremendous favor. The cake would feed 12, she declared, though apparently I'd be eating my slice alone. The cake arrived with fanfare. Chocolate ganache with gold leaf details, clearly expensive. The waiter presented it with sparklers as the family table sang happy birthday. Their voices carried across the restaurant while I sat in my corner like a scolded child. Mom made a show of cutting the first slice for the birthday boy. She gestured for me to come over and receive it, like I was being granted an audience. I approached the table, and she handed me a plate with a generous portion, her smile wide and performative. That's when the waiter appeared with the bill. The leather folder was placed directly in front of me without ceremony. I glanced at the total and suppressed a smile. $2,600. The family table had really outdone themselves with their selections. Premium steaks, Multiple bottles of wine, appetizers, sides, and that custom cake had added up beautifully. I stood up slowly, the bill in my hand, and made my announcement. I told them they might want to try the family table instead for handling this particular responsibility. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Mom's face went white, then red. She stammered that there must be some mistake, that surely they could work something out. My stepdad started reaching for his wallet, then seemed to remember it was empty. I'd heard him mention maxing out his credit cards earlier. My half-siblings suddenly found their phones very interesting. The youngest one mumbled something about not having expected such expensive selections. The newly engaged sister suggested maybe they could split it somehow, but her math skills apparently hadn't improved since high school because she kept arriving at impossibly low individual amounts. I placed the bill gently on the family table and stepped back. I explained that since I was just a guest, financial responsibilities should probably fall to the actual family members. After all, they'd made it quite clear that I didn't qualify for that designation. The waiter stood nearby, clearly torn between professional discretion and obvious fascination with the unfolding drama. Other diners were starting to notice the commotion at what had been the happy birthday table just moments before. Mom tried a different approach, suddenly remembering our shared DNA. She called me son and talked about family obligations and how hurt she was that I would embarrass them like this. She reminded me of all the times she'd been there for me growing up, conveniently forgetting the years of emotional distance and financial requests. I listened patiently, then reminded her of her earlier statement about family versus guests. I asked her to clarify my status, since it seemed to change based on convenience. Was I family when bills needed paying, but a guest when seats needed assigning? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, my stepdad offered to call his brother to borrow money. One of my half-siblings mentioned an emergency credit card. The other started calculating if they could afford an Uber home if they paid their portion. I waited until they'd exhausted their immediate options, then made my final announcement. I told them I'd be leaving now, and they could figure out their family table business among themselves. I wished them luck with the bill and turned toward the exit. Mom called after me, her voice cracking. She said we could talk about this, that maybe there had been a misunderstanding about the seating arrangement. Perhaps we could work something out about the dinner cost. I paused at the threshold and looked back at the family table. They were all staring at me with expressions ranging from panic to anger to disbelief. The fancy restaurant suddenly felt much less impressive with $2,600 worth of debt hanging over it. I told them there was no misunderstanding. They'd made their position perfectly clear, and I'd simply decided to respect it. Guests don't pay family bills, just like guests don't sit at family tables. Update 1. The aftermath started before I even made it to my car. My phone buzzed constantly with calls and texts as I drove home. Mom left 3 voicemails in the first hour, each one progressively more desperate. The first was angry, demanding I come back and fix this situation. The second was pleading, explaining how embarrassing it was for them. The third was manipulative, bringing up my late father and how disappointed he'd be. My half-siblings joined the assault on my phone. The lawyer brother sent a lengthy text about family loyalty and how this would damage relationships permanently. The engaged sister called me selfish and said I'd ruined her good news. The youngest one just sent crying emojis and asked how they were supposed to get home. I turned my phone off and opened a bottle of beer. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt genuinely relaxed. The next morning brought a new wave of contact attempts. Mom had apparently spent the night calling other family members to rally support. My elderly aunt texted asking what had happened, saying Mom was too upset to explain clearly. A cousin I hadn't heard from in 2 years suddenly wanted to chat about family values. But the most interesting message came from my stepdad. He asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss things man to man. No drama, no emotions, just a practical conversation about moving forward. I agreed to meet him that afternoon. He looked exhausted when he walked into the coffee shop. We sat in the back corner, away from other customers, and he got straight to the point. He apologized for the seating arrangement and admitted it was cruel. He explained that Mom had been stressed about money lately and sometimes took it out in petty ways. I listened without interrupting as he laid out their financial situation. The medical bills were real, but there were other debts too. Credit cards, a second mortgage, and some poor investment decisions had left them struggling. The expensive dinner had been Mom's attempt to maintain appearances, even though they couldn't afford it. He asked if I'd consider helping with the restaurant bill as a loan rather than a gift. They'd pay me back in installments, with interest if I wanted. He seemed genuine in his remorse, but I noticed he didn't mention changing how they treated me going forward. I told him I'd think about it. Update 2. I spent the next few days considering stepdad's proposal while my phone continued buzzing with family drama. Apparently, the restaurant had agreed to a payment plan after Mom broke down crying to the manager. They were making minimum payments while trying to figure out the full amount. Meanwhile, the family gossip network was in overdrive. I started hearing from relatives I barely knew, all with opinions about my behavior. Some supported me, saying it was about time someone called out Mom's favoritism. Others thought I was being vindictive and cruel. The most surprising call came from my half-brother's wife. She apologized for laughing at the restaurant and said she'd never realized how differently I was treated. She'd grown up in a large, close family and assumed all siblings had rough patches, but ultimately supported each other. She mentioned that my half-brother was embarrassed about the whole situation but too proud to call me directly. He'd admitted to her that he'd always felt guilty about the obvious favoritism but never knew how to address it without causing family drama. That conversation gave me an idea. I called stepdad back and agreed to help with the restaurant bill, but with conditions. I wanted a family meeting where everyone acknowledged the pattern of treating me differently. Not a dramatic confrontation, but an honest conversation about how things had been and how they needed to change. He agreed immediately, probably relieved that I wasn't going to let them struggle with the debt indefinitely. The family meeting was scheduled for the following Sunday at Mom's house. Everyone would be there, including the partners who'd witnessed the restaurant incident. Update 3. Sunday arrived with all the tension you'd expect. I showed up with a cashier's check for the full restaurant amount, but I kept it in my pocket while we talked. Mom had clearly been coached by stepdad because she started with a prepared apology. She admitted that she'd treated me unfairly over the years and said it was because my father's death had been so painful that sometimes she couldn't separate her grief from her relationship with me. It was the most honest she'd ever been about our complicated history, but it felt like only part of the truth. My half-siblings were more reluctant to participate. The lawyer brother gave a formal apology that sounded like he was reading from a legal document. The engaged sister cried and said she'd never meant to hurt my feelings. The youngest one just looked uncomfortable and mumbled something about not realizing things were so bad. But as the conversation continued, something shifted. Maybe it was the forced honesty, or maybe it was finally having everyone acknowledge what had been obvious for years. We started talking about specific incidents, birthdays where I got less attention, graduations where my achievements were downplayed, holidays where I felt like an afterthought. My half-brother's wife spoke up again, pointing out patterns that even my siblings hadn't fully recognized. She asked direct questions about why I'd been excluded from certain family traditions and why my opinions carried less weight in family decisions. For the first time, my half-siblings seemed to genuinely understand how their behavior had affected me. The youngest one admitted that he'd always seen me as less important because that's how Mom had framed our relationship. The engaged sister said she'd thought I preferred being independent and hadn't realized I felt excluded. By the end of the conversation, something had genuinely changed in the room. Not everything was fixed, and there were still underlying issues to work through. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was talking to family members rather than strangers who happened to share some DNA. I handed over the cashier's check and told them this was a fresh start, not a continuation of old patterns. If they wanted a relationship with me going forward, it had to be based on mutual respect and equal treatment. Mom hugged me for the first time in months, and it felt real rather than performative. 6 months later, we had Thanksgiving dinner together at a restaurant with round-table seating where everyone had identical chairs. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. When the bill came, stepdad reached for it immediately, and nobody suggested I should pay because I was just a guest. Sometimes the most effective way to teach people about family is to show them what it feels like to be treated like an outsider. The restaurant bill was expensive, but finally having honest relationships with my family was worth every penny. The wobbly chair beside the trash can taught all of us something important about where we really belonged at each other's tables.